So, welcome. I'm Professor Joel Wolf of the History Department and the Feinberg Committee, and today I'm happy to welcome you to part of the 2014 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series, which is the series is entitled Migration Matters, Rethinking Immigration in the Modern Americas. Every second year, the History Department organizes this endowed lecture series around a specific topic. The inaugural series in 2004 commemorated race, law, and the civil rights, 50 years of Brown versus the Board of Education. Our second series was Politics and Protest, the 1960s and now. 2008 was Measuring the Value of Human Life, in which we used Kenneth Feinberg's book as the anchor to our reading. In 2010, we focused on sport and society and history, and in 2012, on truth and reconciliation. Each lecture series has featured a wide variety of events, lectures such as this by leading scholars, along with exhibitions, performances, panel discussions, and films. And every year, as in the past, this year, we are pleased to work with various departments throughout the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and across our campus. The Feinberg semester is only possible because of the generosity of Mr. Kenneth Feinberg, a 1967 alumnus of the University of Massachusetts History Department, and his family and friends. Mr. Feinberg completed his BA in history and went on to a distinguished career in law and public service. It kind of sounds like he's still in the midst of a very distinguished career. He's one of the country's leading experts in mediation and alternative dispute resolution. He's worked on the Presidential Advisory Commissions on Human Radiation Experiments and on catastrophic nuclear accidents. He has served as a special master for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, as well as for the fund for the BP Gulf oil spill. Speaking on this campus during the 2010 series, Mr. Feinberg articulated his conviction that the study of history is instrumental in the understanding and analyzing contemporary issues, and we in the History Department, of course, agree. Let me take this opportunity to thank the History Department and the College of Humanities and Fine Art, and particularly the other members of the committee, Brian Bunk, Julio Capo, Sarah Cornell, and Jessica Johnson. Now it really is my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Lesser, the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of History and the Chair of the History Department at Emory University. I wrote this out because I've known Jeff a very long time, and I would spend a long time talking about it right now. I've known Jeff since we were both assistant professors at New England Liberal Arts Colleges back many years ago. As his friend and colleague, I've had the pleasure of reading each of his 4 books as he's published them, or even before in manuscript form. Jeff's first book, Welcoming the Undesirables, Brazil and the Jewish Question, which was published by the University of California Press, quickly established him as the preeminent historian of ethnicity and immigration in Brazil. His second book, Negotiating National Identity, Immigrants, Minorities, and the Struggle for Ethnicity in Brazil, which was published by Duke, put him in the forefront of all historians of modern Brazil. This book is more than a study of ethnicity. It is a major statement on the establishment of Brazilian citizenship and identity. His third book, A Discontented Diaspora, Japanese Brazilians and the Meaning of Ethnic Militancy, also by Duke, was the first comprehensive analysis of Brazil's massive Japanese immigrant community and one of the first, if not the first, studies of ethnicity in the context of the long 1964 to 85 military dictatorship. Jeff's most recent book, Immigration, Ethnicity, and National Identity in Brazil, which Cambridge University Press published, is a terrific and quite popular rethinking of the topics of immigration and ethnicity in Latin America's largest and most diverse nation. I've taught each of these books, and the students generally love them. His books and many articles have received prestigious prizes and are widely read, cited, and admired. Jeff has also held distinguished Fulbright chairs in both Brazil and Israel. In addition to his extraordinary scholarship, Jeff is a wonderful colleague. He not only mentors students in Emory's terrific Latin American history program, he's also a colleague who both younger and established scholars turn to for support and advice. In short, Jeff Lesser is an accomplished historian, leading scholar in the field, and a real mensch. I give you my friend and colleague, Jeff Lesser.
Thank you, Joel. That's kind of you, right? The introduction that my wife prepared. I'm very happy to be here today, and it's nice to see so many old friends, and to get a chance to talk about immigration in Brazil within the context of broader questions of immigration in the Americas. So, I'm one of those lucky people whose life was changed in an instant. For me, the moment came when I was an undergraduate, taking a seminar on Afro-Brazilian politics and culture. and said, "I have a question for everyone, but Jeff, you're not allowed to answer." We all looked around a bit, confused, and then came the question, what is a mikvah? Students each started generating answers related to the topic of the class because they didn't know what this word even meant. Maybe a mikvah was a Yoruba king. Maybe a mikvah was the name of a treaty between Brazil and Portugal. Finally, the professor explained that a mikvah is a Jewish ritual bath, and he was asking a question about a Jewish ritual bath in the context of a course on Afro-Brazilian politics, because he wanted us all to realize that Brazil's population was more complex than one of black and white and mixed. It was more complicated than a country of the descendants of Portuguese colonizers and the descendants of African slaves. So today I'd like to talk about the Brazil of immigrants and their descendants. This is the Brazil of Sephardic and European Jews, of Muslims and Maronite Christians, of millions of people of Japanese descent, of cities with population claiming Lebanese descent bigger than almost any city in the contemporary country of Lebanon. These Brazilians, who often seem to fit into a category that's neither black nor white in Brazil, number in the many, many millions. They are often in the higher echelons of Brazil's economic, educational, and residential spheres. And it's not uncommon to meet professionals and intellectuals and politicians with names like Hanashiro, or Maluf, or Goldenberg, or Matarazzo, or even Rousseff, the name of the current president of Brazil, the daughter of a Bulgarian immigrant. While both Brazil and the... Do you all mind if I take off my jacket? Thank you. Now we can get down to business. All right. While both Brazil and the United States describe themselves as country of immigrants, the meaning of the word immigrant is functionally different in the two places. In the United States, as far as I can tell, I'm not a specialist on the United States, but in the United States, as far as I can tell, many people of immigrant descent define themselves and are described using words like African-American, or Chinese-American, or Muslim-American. In Brazil, however, those hyphens, which are so common in the US, aren't so apparent. A Japanese Brazilian, whose great-great-grandparents immigrated more than a century ago, is called a Japanese, precisely the same word used to describe a tourist visiting from Tokyo. A Syrian Lebanese, this is the word that's used in Brazil to define those of Middle Eastern, Christian, or Muslim descent, is usually called an Arab, even if her family migrated to Brazil in the 19th century. On the surface, this disappearance of the hyphen may seem exclusionary, denying full Brazilian national identity to millions of Brazilians. In other words, if you think about it in a US context, when you say to a Brazilian, you're Japanese, you're kind of saying, you're not so Brazilian, aren't you? Right? It might seem that way on the surface when we think about it within the context of the United States. But I'm not sure that's precisely what's going on there. And that's what I'd like to explore today, in part by making comparisons to the United States. One of the big differences between Brazil and the US has to do with the origins myths. In the US, the myth of the promised land suggests that newcomers better themselves upon arrival because somehow the nation of the United States, is intrinsically great. In other words, it seems to me that what makes a Polish American better, I'm speaking now in cultural myths here, I'm not making my own judgment, but what makes a Polish American better than someone who's Polish is because upon coming to the United States, that person or that person's family was improved by coming here. Making it in the United States takes place in part as people are transformed from low echelon immigrants to high echelon ethnic Americans. In Brazil, however, the relationship between immigration and national identity is very different. Most people across class, race, and ethnic lines have traditionally seen immigrants as civilizing an imperfect nation, so a radically different idea of the nation. Immigrants were historically, and continue to be until this day, seen as saviors in Brazil because they improve Brazil, not because they are improved by Brazil. Immigrants were and are viewed as creating a future Brazil that's better than the present one. When Brazilians claim, as they often do, that they live in o país do futuro, the country of the future, this is one of these phrases that Brazilians use a lot to describe their country, they're suggesting that Brazil is changing for the better, right? That's what the future is all about, that something better is happening later on. In this cultural context, then, in Brazil, being an immigrant is a high status category. And thus, in Brazil, the finite experience of migration does not end with physical arrival and can span generations, right? That's quite different from the United States. If somebody came up to me and said, oh, you're a Russian immigrant, Jeff, because my great-grandparents came from Russia, we'd say, that's weird. I mean, the guy didn't immigrate from any place. But in Brazil, this word immigrant means something different. Being defined as a foreigner or as an immigrant often means you're a better kind of Brazilian. And we see this kind of represented. This is a stamp from the government of Brazil. And it's not perfect, but what you have are kind of people from all over the world kind of coming into Brazil, right, which is in the center, and theoretically making it better, right? This is a nationalist stamp, right? This is a stamp about the future of Brazil being better. Mass immigration to Brazil began in the latter decades of the 19th century as the end of slavery led many elites to believe that Brazil needed to be whitened with European immigrants. Again, for those of you who aren't Brazil specialists, this word whitened isn't mine. This was the official word used by elites in Brazil to describe what they were doing by bringing in immigrants. The largest numbers of immigrants to Brazil came from Italy, although by 1930, the country was filled with people from around the globe, from the Middle East and Asia, from Eastern and Southern Europe. Well, each particular case, if we kind of bore down and looked at each immigration history, was filled with all sorts of internal conflict and a great deal of external conflict, especially between new immigrants and Afro-Brazilians. The idea of improving Brazil through immigration has been an important national goal and remains so to this day. 19th and 20th century policymakers assumed a high correlation between immigrant entry and social change. And more than 5 million immigrants flowed into Brazil between 1872 and 1972. Immigrants always arrived, no matter how poor they were, they always arrived in a superior cultural position to the ex-slaves who for generations had been deprived of formal education and whose work had been largely uncompensated. Brazil's whitening policy in the 19th century, while often used to exclude Afro-Brazilians, also expanded who was considered white in Brazil. And often, whites in Brazil were reconfigured as people other than those who were from Italy or Spain or Portugal. A federal deputy summed it up with clarity in 1935 when the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies, the Brazilian Congress, voted to give subsidies to Japanese but not Portuguese immigrants. The Japanese colonists are much whiter than the Portuguese, he proclaimed, And in the vote that followed, there was an overwhelming agreement with it, right? So in Brazil in 1935, it was officially voted that Japanese were whiter than Portuguese. And again, that challenges us to think about what does whiteness mean? In the same way I'm asking you to rethink what does immigrant mean or what does foreign mean, I'm also challenging you to think what whiteness means. Immigration increasingly became a common way that Brazilians across classes and generations described their hopes for the country. By the early 20th century, immigration and immigrants were no longer a description of movement, right? We often think of immigration as like starting, dude gets on the boat, and he goes across the ocean, he gets off the boat, and then, immigration has ended, right? Now there's something else going on called acculturation or adaptation or something else. But in Brazil, that's not how it works. That immigration, it stayed, right? And so that idea of immigration isn't just about the people who came over on the boat, it's also about their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. The word immigration, which in the United States we think of as impermanent, it's something you do temporarily and then you don't do it anymore, in Brazil is a word linked to permanence. Certain kinds of people in Brazil, independent of where they're born, are always immigrants engaged in a Brazilian improvement project. Let me give you some examples. In the mid-1940s, for example, one of Brazil's ministers decided that newborn babies were immigrants and wrote, "Little children are our best immigrant. Let's not forget this truth and support those who will make the future Brazil bigger, stronger, and more respected." Right? What an interesting way to use the word immigrant to talk about babies born in Brazil. In 1974, a new superhighway linking Brazil's Atlantic coast with the city of Sao Paulo was named the Rodovia dos Imigrantes, the Immigrants Highway. Its path metaphorically repeating the journey of millions of Europeans, Asians, and Middle Easterners during the late 19th and early 20th century. So in other words, today, when you drive on that highway, you're kind of being an immigrant, even if you're born in Brazil. In 1981, the hit nighttime soap opera, have you all heard of telenovelas? It's this phenomenon in Latin America, these kind of daily evening soap operas. So the 1981 hit in Brazil was called The Immigrants, and listen how it was promoted. Portuguese, Japanese, Spanish, Italians, Arabs, don't miss the most Brazilian soap opera on television. This strong sense in Brazil that being foreign makes a person a better Brazilian becomes clear in the story of Chen Zizao, a 24-year-old labor migrant to Brazil. In 2012, Chen was contracted as a midfielder by Sao Paulo's Corinthians Football Club. This is Brazil's greatest soccer team, Corinthians. And became known in Brazil as very funny. His name is Zizão, but in Brazil he became Zizão, right? A very nice Brazilianization of his name. And at the press conference, and here you can see a photo from the press conference, where he was introduced to the public, a pregnant woman from China, you can't tell that she's pregnant, but trust me, she is, from China, sat in the front row holding a sign written in Mandarin saying, "If you give me your jersey and sign it, I will name my child after you." And here you see him giving, right, at the press conference, right, he calls the lady, the pregnant lady and her husband up and, signs his jersey and presents it to her, right? And this wasn't planned. I mean, you can tell that he's a kid, right? I mean, he's not entirely sure what's going on, but seems the right thing to do. This story made news across Brazil and was portrayed generally as a microcosm of Brazil's new relationship with China. While some commentators use the Zizao case to express racist and xenophobic positions, most didn't look at it that way. Rather, they took what I would call the traditional Brazilian position, saying, look at how these Chinese immigrants are changing Brazil for the better. We bring Zizou in, and he makes the great football club even greater. We bring in these immigrants, and they have children who work hard and do all these other things. Now, what interested me in this story, other than my love for the Corinthian soccer club, but what really interested me as a scholar in this story happened about 2 weeks after the press conference. This is when the hosts of a kind of comedy talk show on one of Brazil's largest television networks revealed that the entire episode, not the soccer part, but the pregnant lady and her husband, was a setup. The woman, it turned out, wasn't pregnant. The man wasn't her husband. In fact, she was they were both Brazilian actors that the producers had found in a neighborhood in São Paulo called Liberdade, which is known as the Japanese neighborhood of the city. When the actress was invited on the talk show, it's kind of like a Conan talk show or something like that, I guess I would describe it. So when the two actors were invited on this talk show, a series of events happened that in the United States we would consider horribly racist, but in Brazil would be considered the normal way that people talk to each other. So the two actors come on, and the host of the program, does something like this, and he goes, something like this, right? This is how he kind of greets them. The actor and actress weren't at all offended by this, apparently. Maybe they were offended, but they didn't get up and walk off the stage. Rather, they started laughing and lecturing the host back. And as the actress put it, why are you talking like a Chinese? I'll say it in Portuguese, then I'll explain in English. She says, a gente fala português porque somos japoneses, okay? We speak Portuguese because we are Japanese. Now, clearly by Japanese, she doesn't mean from Tokyo, right? She clearly is trying to make a distinction between Zizou, who's an actual immigrant, right? The guy's from China, like the real China, the actual China. He came over on like an actual plane and doesn't speak Portuguese, and themselves. But what an interesting way to phrase it, because it's a mix of foreignness and national identity at the same time. When she says we speak Portuguese because we are Japanese, she knows, and everybody listening knows, that what she means is we are Brazilian. Right? That's what that is. It's not even a code. It's so obvious as to be uncoded. Right? So here we see a perfect example. She's mocking the host by kind of saying, I'm a better Brazilian than you are. How do we know I'm a better Brazilian? Because I'm Japanese. Right? That's what's going on in this thing. Now, while the idea that migration matters may seem obvious to anybody who shows up at a lecture series like this, immigrants in Brazil and people of immigrant descent, as we see in this story here, are in a sense being hailed for their non-normative Brazilianness, right? I mean, I know it's a little weird to wrap your head around, right? The idea that being foreign makes you a better national, right? It's a funny way to think about it from a U.S. perspective, but trust me. The division between the categories, then, of the not-so-great real Brazilians and the more excellent foreign Brazilians, in a way, it's simultaneously exclusionary and inclusionary, because obviously all of this has to do with stereotypes, right? I mean, these stories I'm telling you have nothing to do with the actual people here, right? It's all kind of myths upon myths upon myths. In doing so, being a foreign Brazilian, right? Being a gente fala português porque somos japoneses, right? That kind of Brazilian, has a positive cachet of improving Brazil. And what's the improvement of Brazil? Well, one important part of it, and I think this is important for all of you to understand, is in saying that, they're saying, also in a not so quoted way, we're not black, right? So in other words, this non-immigrant Brazilian are kind of, what's the problem with it? Why are we worried about the future? Why are these immigrants so great? Well, one of the things about them is they're not black, right? And so we see that going on there. It's a very complicated game. Ideas of immigrant national identity are so strong in Brazil that it's a part of national political discourse. Something I saw when I did a research project on Brazilian politicians of Asian descent, supported strongly by Professor Alvarez here when she was in Rio at the Ford Foundation. So one of the things we did in this project, so unlike in the United States, where ethnic politicians don't have terribly high national prominence, right? We expect maybe in California, or in Hawaii, you'll see some Japanese American or Chinese American politicians, but it's not typical at the national stage. In Brazil, Brazilians of minority descent are very important on the national political stage. Brazilians of Middle Eastern descent, of Japanese descent, of Jewish descent are very prominent in Brazil. So the project was to go talk to politicians in Brazil of Japanese descent about how they understood their Brazilians. And we went out of our way to try to find politicians of all different kind of political stripes, right? So we had right-wing ones and left-wing ones, we had cool ones and darky ones. I mean, we had the entire gamut. One of the people who we talked to was Luis Gushiken, now the late Luis Gushiken. This one is Gushiken, right? A close confidant of this man, former President Lula. Okay? So in other words, this is big time politics, right? This is the president and his minister. President Lula was of the Workers' Party, the PT, and Gushiken, when Lula was the president, was the Brazilian Minister of Communications. I got to spend a couple of days with Gushiken, and it was a fascinating experience. First, he explained to me that he didn't ever get any votes from Japanese Brazilians for two reasons, right? So again, already breaking down all the ethnic ideas of how things work. A, because as a member of the Workers' Party, Japanese Brazilians tended not to vote for them because they were in the higher educational realms, the higher economic realms, and they tended to vote for more conservative parties. But equally important to Gushiken in his idea about why people did or didn't vote for him was that he was of Okinawan descent. I don't know if everybody knows what Okinawa is. Okinawa is an island at the bottom of Japan. And people from Okinawa are kind of considered, have traditionally been considered kind of a lower ethnicity in the Japanese scheme of things, right? So, something like that. So he said, I have a problem when I go out and campaign for votes. Japanese Brazilians, they don't like me because I'm Okinawan, and they don't like me because I'm liberal. And what was incredible, though, was he sold himself as a candidate as Japanese, right? So it was a really weird kind of contradiction, right? So how did he sell himself as Japanese? So for example, one of the things he would do, this is when he's minister, but you see this suit and this white shirt and tie? So before Lula was president, the Workers' Party-like outfit was a short sleeve white shirt open, right? That's how the Workers' Party politicians dressed, with one single exception, Luis Gushiken, who always had on a tie and a suit. He would, in his campaign propaganda, fill it with, I don't know how to explain it, like kind of fake Japanese-looking letters. And you know those styles, those fonts that are kind of Japanese-ish looking or something like that? So there was this fascinating contradiction where he's, on the one hand, selling himself as Japanese, on the other hand, talking about how Japanese Brazilians don't like him, and, as happened in the next day's events, how he doesn't like Japanese Brazilians. So one day I went with Gushi Ken. I got to spend a day on the campaign trail, and it was a great day. And we started out the morning at a speech he gave at the Okinawa Kenjin-kai, which a Kenjin-kai is something like a community center, an ethnic community center. And in Brazil, you have ethnic community centers for Japanese Brazilians based on where the ancestors immigrated from. Like the different, you know, it's like having the Massachusetts Society and the Connecticut Society and the Rhode Island Society, something like that. So we start off the morning and we go off to the Okinawa Community Center, where Gushi Ken is giving a lecture to a group of young baseball players. For those of you who don't know this, Brazilian youth baseball is very internationally powerful. And many of the baseball players are of Japanese descent, right? So this is one of the kind of transfers that goes on over generations. So he gets up there before this group of kids who are going out to play baseball against another community center from another part of Japan. And if I can use a rough translation of what he said, it was something like this. He said, "Young men, those Japanese have treated us like shit for generations and generations. And you Okinawan boys better go kick some Japanese ass out there today," right? I just gave you the clean version. He gave a tougher kind of thing, right? Now again, fascinating because in this whole thing, he never uses the word Brazilian, although he's only talking about Brazilians, right? There are no people from Okinawa, no people from Japan involved, right? He's doing all this. And as he explained to me, and so I said to him, I said, "This is incredible," right? I said, "You clearly hate Japanese Brazilians. They clearly don't like you very much either. Yet you sell yourself as Japanese all the time. What's going on, right? I don't get it." I mean, I kind of got it, but you know, it's a good research strategy to ask the subject. "I don't understand, you tell me." And this is what he said, and this is a direct quote. He says, "Everyone knows that Brazilian politicians are corrupt and lazy. But since I'm Japanese, everybody knows I'm the best Brazilian politician possible." So again, an amazing kind of idea about the permanence of immigration, right? Gushi Ken isn't a guy from Japan or from Okinawa. He's a guy from Brazil, right? He didn't speak Japanese. He actually doesn't even like Japanese food. He doesn't do any Japanese ethnic stuff, right? But a clear sense that his Japaneseness makes him a great Brazilian politician. William Wu, a right-wing politician, all right, so Gushi Ken was on the left, this guy, William Wu, was on the right, told me the same thing as Gushi Ken did in a slightly different way. And I quote, "My mother is Japanese, my father is Taiwanese, and my wife is Korean. I'm the best Brazilian of us all." Now, just to be clear, his Japanese mom, his Taiwanese dad, and his Korean spouse are all Brazilians, right? This is all a different way. So in other words, this is a kind of cultural construction of foreignness to talk about his Brazilianness. Now, Gushi Ken and Wu, these two politicians, aren't trendsetters or simple marketeers of political expediency in portraying immigrant-based ethnicity as critical to a better Brazilian national identity. In fact, they're just mimicking representations that are easy to find in every area of Brazilian society. Individuals represent themselves and are labeled as immigrants in all sorts of situational ways. in everything from sex work to marketing. For example, the Brazilian electronics firm Toshiba features, their advertising to this day features one of the most famous lines in the history of Brazilian advertising. Os nossos japoneses são mais criativos que os japoneses dos outros. Our Japanese are more creative than everybody else's Japanese. Once when I was teaching at the University of Sao Paulo, I asked my students, what did this, like how did they understand this? I projected this and asked them, and they had very fascinating responses. So everyone, this was like a huge class, like almost like in an auditorium. There were hundreds of kids in this class. Everyone, there was 100% agreement that the phrase, our Japanese, meant Brazilians, right? No, the only thing they found odd was that I was asking the question, right? That the dopey professor was wanting to understand it and didn't get it. But who everybody else's Japanese created a very fascinating debate. Some of the students said that this advertisement is about comparing Brazilian Japanese with Japanese from Japan. And that the problem with Japanese from Japan is their uptight, workaholic kind of nerdatrons. And that our Japanese, right, were better because they became fun-loving, creative, partying, etc. So in other words, these students understood our Japanese to take on stereotypes about Brazilians and kind of turn them for the good, right? Other students in the class had a completely kind of Americanist in the broad sense of the Americas perspective, and said everybody else's Japanese meant Japanese Paraguayans. And that when Japanese people immigrated to Paraguay, their descendants became like worse and worse. Whereas Brazil, right, when the Japanese immigrants had come to Brazil, they became these better and better ones, right? So kind of, again, a fascinating idea about immigration and ethnicity. Now here's another version of our Japanese are more creative than everybody else's. This is an advertisement for a Brazilian, how do you call it in English? Like refrigerators in your kitchen and stuff like this. And it's a very nationalist ad. The company is called Brastemp, right? So the Brás of Brazil. Their advertisement has the giant B in it, right? But what's the tagline? An Arab married to a Japanese. What could be more Brazilian, right? And so what you have is this kind of Arab guy wearing, I don't know, a Cuban shirt, serving esfijas, which are a very common bar food in Brazil, but which mimic a food that you would find in the Middle East, to his ostensibly Japanese Brazilian wife, although she's got on some kind of Chinese clothing. It's a wonderful kind of confusion of things. And finally, I'd like to show you two photographs that take this to another extreme, right? Because I want to show you all the ways that this is happening. So now this isn't a commercial poster in the traditional sense. This is a poster from an ultra-Orthodox religious group in Brazil, a hyper-ritualistic group, which is promoting a Jewish ritual that has to do with carrying this thing around, right? That's what the ritual is about. But what's the promotion? The promotion is, it's the biggest sushi festival in the city. And again, why is that? Is it just because sushi tastes good? No. It's because sushi represents Japaneseness, which represents better Brazilianness, which thus kind of legitimates this entire ritual activity under the context of national identity. So by doing this, what on the surface might seem as kind of like a weird ethnically separatist kind of activity, right? Marching around with this stuff, right? Becomes this highly Brazilian activity because you're doing it in the context of sushi. And what could be more Brazilian than sushi, right? It's the best Brazilian food of all. As you can see from this one as well, which is also, this is from a competitor religious group, okay, also Jewish, in which their Sabbath candles right? So in this particular ritual, you light candles on a Friday night, and their Sabbath candles are represented, again, by sushi, again, as a nationalist kind of thing. You might think of it in the United States context is, think of how many ethnic groups serve Chinese food, right? And it's kind of served as Americanness, right? How do you really show you're American? You eat Chinese food. Okay. As these images show, and as I've been arguing throughout, Brazilians treat immigrant as a status that's ancestral or inherited or even created, one that remains even among those who were born in the country. In other words, immigration is not just about the past. Rather, it allows Brazilians to imagine a future that's different and better than the present one. Non-elites agreed with this formulation. So you see this idea about immigrants making this better Brazil across class lines. It's quite impressive. In fact, when we did another project where we went and talked about ethnicity in very poor areas of Brazil, right? We went into poor areas and asked people, like, when we say the name, when we say the word Japanese, what do you think? When we say the word Chinese, what do you think? When we say the word Jew, what do you think? And it was kind of incredible because in these areas, very few people were able to say, my friend is, right? So there was very little direct contact, but they all talked about these groups as somehow being better, right? It was kind of a remarkable penetration of the idea of immigration creating a better Brazil. But of course, these ideas aren't simple. And I haven't spoken too much about how the Brazilians themselves feel about it, right? The Brazilians of ethnic descent. And for Brazilians of ethnic descent, there's a kind of complicated relationship between being judged with a stereotype that says you're better, but it's a stereotype. It's something like what in the United States is called the model minority myth, right? Have you heard that? Oh, you're something, you must be good with math, right? Well, it's good to be good with math, I think, right? That's not a bad thing to be good with math, but maybe you don't feel so great about it if somebody looks at you and assumes that because of your ethnicity. And this kind of complicated idea for the other end can be seen in this incredible poster. So, this cartoon. This is a cartoon from the 1940s that was published in what at the time was Brazil's most widely read newspaper. And the headline at the top is, if you tell me what street you're on, I'll tell you who you are. Okay? So that's already like a kind of complicated idea, right? That by knowing a location, you can tell who the person is, right? That's kind of awkward. And the way the thing is set up is, the image isn't so good, but at the bottom here is the name of different streets. And then there's the immigrant group that's kind of linked to it, right? So this is Arab, Japanese, Afro-Brazilian, Portuguese, Italian, that has to do with fashion, right? Fashion and sexuality, and Jewish. Okay? And you see very, very clearly, right, all the different stereotypes. So Arab Brazilians is kind of angry, right, or bossy. Japanese Brazilians as kind of nerdy, right? He's reading. Afro-Brazilians as kind of, I don't know. The image is supposed to be like sleazy. That's what the image is, right? Portuguese, right, is kind of goofy, fashion, and then Jewish Brazilians is kind of outsiders and bound by tradition. And interestingly enough, you see two groups that are causing this particular commentator consternation, which are Jews and Japanese, and they're illustrated as having children, right? That's the scary part. that they're producing more and more, that they're kind of out of control. So I want to mention this because I've kind of talked about immigration and immigrants and permanent immigration as all positive, but it's not just the case. One of the things I found a lot when I've been doing my research is that a lot of these positive foreign words that are used in Brazil, when you speak to members of the group in kind of closed internal situations, they talk to you about how much they resent it. So for example, Japanese Brazilians, many Japanese Brazilians really dislike being called Japanese. Although they realize that in being called Japanese, they're gaining certain kinds of cultural advantages. One of the things, and this happens in all sorts of areas. For example, you might not know this, but Brazil is one of the capitals of plastic surgery in the world. And the highest number, right, not the highest dollar cost, but the highest number of plastic surgeries that are done in some years are Japanese Brazilian women doing their eyes to become less Japanese Brazilian looking, right? Having their eyes, I don't know, rounded? I don't know how to explain the procedure exactly. So I know a lot of people who have done this, and I say, why do you know, what's going on? And when I started asking the question, I expected originally to hear something about sexuality in terms of, by looking less Japanese, I'll seem more sexy. But what I heard was exactly the opposite. What the women would say to me is, I got a problem. I have a PhD in economics. But when I go to work, everybody says, hey, Japanese girl, you're like a geisha, right? And so this surgery is done for the opposite of that sexuality, right? So that's a pretty strong statement, right? Changing your body as a rejection of a societal stereotype, right? So that's pretty serious. But let's finish up here, so we have plenty of time for questions. The idea that Brazilianness and foreignness are completely interlinked in the imaginary can be found in all moments, in all places. A conversation I had in a Korean luncheonette in Bom Retiro, a neighborhood known for its population of Italians in the 19th century, Eastern European Jews in the 20th century, and Bolivians and Koreans today, hammered home how this imaginary worked. One day I went into this neighborhood. It's a neighborhood I like very much. It's my kind of place. And I decided to go have a bite to eat of something called falafel. Falafel is a Middle Eastern chickpea ground thing. And there's a falafel place I love in this neighborhood, run by a lady named Malha. Malha was born in Yemen, immigrated to Brazil with her husband, and opened the falafel shop after her husband was put in jail for running guns. Right? So Malha was running a falafel shop in order to survive. And it's a very interesting falafel shop because it's one of the few, probably, falafel shops in the world where you can get your menu in Hebrew or Portuguese or Korean. So I went in to get my falafel, but there was a problem. Malha's was closed. I was very bummed out because I was very hungry. And I saw across from it a little tiny Korean restaurant. So I went in, and a guy in terrible Portuguese said, you're not going to like the food here. And I said, don't worry, I like Korean food. He said, well, you know, there's only a Korean menu. You won't be able to order. I said, as you can see. And I said, don't worry. I can read every language when it comes to food. Give me the menu and I will come up with something that I like. So I get a menu and order my meal, and it's great. And the waiter says to me in this really heavy accent, a young guy, he says, you are the first Brazilian to ever eat in this restaurant. I said, I'm not Brazilian. I'm from the United States. This is in Portuguese. Eu sou brasileiro, sou americano. The guy says, in English, dude, I just moved here from California. He had just finished his degree from UCLA and was sent to Sao Paulo to help with the family business. He was living in this neighborhood where his little cousins were all in the Jewish school. They all spoke great Hebrew, and one of them had won the prize the previous year as the best Hebrew speaker in the Jewish school, right? So a very interesting, right, idea, because in his mind, this was all part of Brazilians, not foreigners. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I said that there's nothing more Brazilian than being foreign. And I've now kind of said that there's nothing more Brazilian than being a Hebrew-speaking Korean-American selling food in Sao Paulo. Yet, of course, there are limits to the arguments of how much this crossing can go back and forth. And one of those limits appeared to me about a decade ago when I heard a story. And the story was told to me by a historian who was about 40 years old, who heard that Shizuka Yamazaki, one of Brazil's most important cinema personalities, and the director of this film Gaijin, which was Brazil's submission to the Cannes Film Festival in 1981. This historian heard that Shizuka Yamazaki was making a second film called Gaijin 2. Now, the idea of the first film was that Japanese immigrants came to Brazil, and in Brazil they discovered they were Gaijin. Gaijin is a Japanese word that means something like outsider or foreigner or something like that, right? So the first film is all about how these Japanese immigrants come to Brazil from this powerful Japan, right, of the 1910s and 1920s, and they show up in Brazil and they're outsiders. And the idea of the second film that she was going to make was about how Brazilians in the 1980s migrated to Japan to work. Japanese Brazilians migrated to Japan to work, thinking they were going home, like home in this kind of conceptual sense, but discovered in Japan that they weren't Japanese, but Brazilians, and were yet again foreigners. So the story I heard about this historian, from this historian, was that he had heard that the director of Gaijin 2 was having an open casting call and was looking to find young actors and actresses of between 18 and 25 years old to perform in roles in this film as Japanese Brazilians, etc. Right? And the historian had clearly heard one of my lectures and kind of said, well, in Brazil, there's all this flexibility. Japanese is Brazilian, whatever. And he decided he was going to try to get a part in the movie Gaijin 2 as an 18 to 25-year-old Japanese Brazilian. So the historian goes off to the casting call, he gets in the line, and people are very nice, so he said. And after a while, the guy in front of the historian turns around, and again I'm going to say it first in Portuguese for the Portuguese speakers because they'll appreciate how devastating it was, turns around to the historian and says, "O senhor não é japonês, não," which means something like, "Old man, all right? You're not really Japanese." The historian looks and says, "Of course I'm an 18 to 25-year-old Japanese Brazilian." Goes on for a few more minutes. The next person turns around and says, "Come on, you're not really an 18 to 25-year-old Japanese Brazilian, are you?" So finally the historian agrees that he's trying to pass, right? That he's gotten online, that he's really 41 or 42 years old, that he's bald, that he has a face that looks like that, right? And and that he's not Japanese Brazilian. Immediately the guy who starts off says, don't worry, I'm not Japanese Brazilian either. And he pulls out a piece of paper with his fake Japanese Brazilian credentials that he's made up to get a part in the movie, which was the same thing the historian was, of course, doing. The woman in front of him overhears this conversation and says, oh, I'm Korean. I'm trying to get in too. And she pulls out her fake story of her life. So what's the point of this? The point is that there are all these people who are trying to get on cast in this movie. Everybody wants to be in the movies, right? It's awesome, right? Or trying to get into this movie by passing. And with the one exception of the poor historian, it actually works, because the end of the story is eventually the producer comes along and the historian tries to talk his way, into being an 18 to 25-year-old. That, I think, was more of the problem than the Japanese Brazilian part. And eventually it turns out that the producer had read one of the historian's books in preparation for the movie. So the historian gets invited to spend the day at the casting call, right, talking to the director. And the situation was really remarkable, because each person would come in, and the first thing the director would say is, are you Japanese or not? And you could see each of these young actors and actresses trying to figure out what was the right answer to the question, right? Nobody could kind of figure out, what does that mean in Brazil? Does it mean, are you Brazilian? Does it mean something else? So with that story, I'd like to conclude and to suggest to you that as you think about migration and why it matters over the course of this lecture series, that it's very important to remember that A, the United States is not the only model of thinking about migration. That the United States is not the correct model to which we measure everything else against, right? But rather there are many models to think about migrants and migration, etc. And the second thing I'd like to insist to you and leave with you with is that when we think about migration, don't think of it as movement, but think about it as people. Thank you very much. What happens now?
You ask for questions. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
Can you repeat the last statement?
The last, I think my last words were, thank you very much. I said that the last two things were, I mean, this is important. I think there's often a tendency in the United States to think that our model, that the models used in the United States about ethnicity or race or immigration are kind of the right way, and everything else models against it. So that was one point I wanted to make, that I'm not trying to say Brazil is better or worse than the United States. It's definitely different, right? And the second thing is that it's always important to remember that migration is about people, right? It's not about some like abstract numbers, right? 50,000 left and came, right? That individuals are involved. Yes, please. Yeah, you have to speak loud. I have a terrible hearing.
I was wondering if you could comment on the situation of two immigrant groups who vary in terms of legal status and race, and that would be African immigrants and the undocumented Bolivian.
Oh, sure. Okay. So the questioner is asked about, so Brazil continues to be a country that receives immigrants. And two of the large immigrant groups in Brazil now, in contemporary times, are people from Africa, at least in the city I study in Sao Paulo, from Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, and people from the Andes, Bolivian and Peruvian, not usually Ecuador. And their situation, in some ways, my prediction, which is always a mistake for a historian to make, but my prediction is that 20 years from now, we are going to talk about African Brazilians, as opposed to Afro-Brazilians, African Brazilians, and Bolivian Brazilians, and Peruvian Brazilians in very positive terms. We're already, for example, in the city of Sao Paulo, we see this very clearly with Bolivian immigrants, who are largely undocumented, who are very poor, but who have a kind of, there's already a kind of public idea that the Bolivians have come to town and they've taken over, and that's probably not the way. They've settled in areas that used to be terrible and made them better. They're sending their kids to public schools, which used to be terrible, and now those schools are functioning again, right? So it's fitting in that way. Now, of course, like all new immigrants, they suffer many of the other stereotypes, right? I mean, there are stereotypes of health, there are stereotypes that have to do with dirtiness. African immigrants spend a lot of time trying to make clear that they're not Afro-Brazilians. So as is the case we've seen in the United States, for example, in Rhode Island, this is very clear with Cape Verdeans, right? People of Americans of Cape Verdean descent, right? This very strong discourse that, wait a second, those Afro-Americans is one thing, and we're some other thing, right? Very clear ideas about that. Now, because most of these immigrants are at the lower ends of the economic spectrum, they often live in areas of large cities with more crime, right? So there are lots of issues with crime, not surprisingly. I mean, it's not like the police in Brazil are the perfect crime-fighting force under any set of circumstances, but with undocumented workers, even less so. However, I do want to make a really important comparative point, which is, in the United States, where, if you buy my argument, people believe that it's something about the kind of mystical nature of the country that makes the immigrants better. One of the reactions to that belief, what goes together with that belief, is strong strains of anti-immigrantism, right? I mean, if we think about the history of the United States, there have been incredible anti-immigrant movements in this country for a very, very long time, right? I live in Georgia, in which we are proud in Georgia to deport the valedictorians of universities because, you know, they were brought over without documents when they were 1 year old, right? That's really strong anti-immigrant sentiment, right? When you take the smartest kid in the school and you get rid of him for that. In Brazil, however, this almost never happens. For the last 30 years, the Brazilian government has done an amnesty program every 5 years on schedule. You go to the federal police, doesn't matter how you came, what you came, you do it, and you get legalized, right? And I think this is, again, about this idea that immigrants are so deeply desired in Brazil to improve, if you will, that they're willing to, that the state looks to immigrants and looks to make them into Brazilians. So in the case of the Bolivians now, for example, I mean, there's already an entire generation of formally undocumented Bolivian immigrants who are now documented Bolivian immigrants whose children are Brazilians.
Yes. A question about, I don't mean to make you draw too many analogies to the United States and North America, but one of the notions I'm familiar with is the idea that we, of course, have a really contradictory relationship to Native Americans, both the sort of idea of the noble and the ignoble savage, and that had a relationship for some thinkers in colonial and early America to the environment. And some people speculated or theorized that after 3 or 4 generations living in the environmental conditions of North America, that perhaps people who emigrated here would take on some of the more positive characteristics of Native Americans. And that changed over the course of, into the early 20th century, where people became more concerned with, first of all, they debunked that. but then they also became more concerned with immigrants and how people would sort of almost become racialized, or their bodies would take on these sort of specificities.
Right.
But there is an environmental factor there. I wonder if that relates to Brazil at all.
Okay, so, I mean, there are people who've written entire books on that. So we'll start at the beginning. First of all, the Native American thing in Brazil is really different, in part because indigenous Brazilians, at least until very recently, were literally disappeared out of the Brazilian nation. Right? That they're just not part of the discussion, right? In terms of the idea that the environment changes, so there was I mean, you know this, but for people who don't, there was a theory in the late 19th and early 20th century called eugenics, right? And there were two strains of it. And one had to do with, like, you would be changed by the environment you were in, and in Brazil, there was another strain because there was this idea in this scientific idea about the environment that there were higher and lower countries, right? So tropical countries like Brazil were problematic. So theorists in Brazil, of course, had to come up with a theory that the country wouldn't change you for the worse, right? And that's the switch, right? So you change the country for the better, right? Was kind of how it worked. I know I'm not precisely answering your question, but it's something like that. So for example, one of the things, so this gets back to the whitening thing, right? So in the United States, there has traditionally been incredible kind of obsession or paranoia about racial pollution. Like there were these laws called the one-drop rule and stuff like that, right? So until relatively recently, right? Like they would say, well, so-and-so is African-American because they would count back generations, right? In Brazil, it was the opposite. You could whiten yourself, right? And who white was didn't just mean like this white, right? So for example, in the 1930s, the Japanese government would produce these books for distribution in Brazil. And they were books of photographs of, I don't know if they were real or just made up, but the photographs would be of a Japanese immigrant man married to a Euro-Brazilian woman whose children all came out white, right? And so the idea was that the Japanese immigrants were helping in the whitening project of the Brazilian government. And so if you could kind of marry yourself a Japanese immigrant, you were going to become, you were going to make your kids whiter, not less whiter, but more white, right? So that's a radical, that's like the opposite of the States.
Yeah, totally different.
I just want to interrupt. There might be more questions, but I want to make a couple quick announcements, which is after we're done here, there's a reception for everyone in the lobby of the 6th floor of Herder, and there'll be wine, cheese, and appetizers. Also, Professor Lesser's books are for sale in the back, and I know that the people interested in the wine, cheese, and appetizers don't think this is the most important part, but the most important part is that teachers in the audience who are attending as part of the History Institute should sign in, because you're here to get signed. So I just want, before anyone else leaves, I want to get that out.
Yes, sir.
How do Brazilians view the Confederados that came to Brazil after the Southern?
That's a great question. Okay, so the gentleman has asked. So after, this is crazy, but it's true. So after the Civil War ended in the United States, a significant group of American slave owners migrated to Brazil so they could keep their slaves, because Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. And they created colonies. The one that I've been to is called Americano, right? Americaville or something. like this. And they tried to recreate in Brazil this this world of the American South that was supposedly lost after the end of the Civil War. Now what's interesting is, over time, and I think this is the question you're asking, the descendants of these people became a kind of Brazilian ethnicity called Confederados, which means something like, if we put it in US terms, something like Southern US hyphen Brazilians, right? I guess we would call it something like that. And of course, over time, I mean, slavery was abolished in Brazil, that world did end. What's fascinating is that those Confederados, those Confederate Brazilians, have remained a kind of ethnicity until this day. So in this town, Americana, for example, every year there's like Confederate Day, and people dress up in their old Confederate outfits and kind of do their thing, and it's seen it's not seen as negative or problematic. I think it's as more problematic in the United States than it's seen in Brazil. In this part of Brazil, you meet lots of people whose names are like Jefferson Davis Swartz or something like that, right? There'll be that. And through the 1950s, this is amazing, teams of linguistic specialists from the United States would go to these cities to talk to the old people to find out how English was spoken in the United States. Because one of the phenomena that sometimes happens in immigrant communities is that, or immigrant descent communities, is they preserve a language style, a linguistic style, someplace else that's no longer found in the country anymore, right? Because our language in the country is constantly modernizing, right? But we're not modernizing our kind of internal ethnic language. I have a friend, or Joshua knows this guy as well. Professor Roth knows this guy as well. We have a friend, Professor Mori in Sao Paulo, and his wife told me this hysterical story. So she's Brazilian, but she's one of the very few Japanese Brazilians who really speaks great Japanese. She's a translator and an intellectual and things like that. So about 10 years ago, she took her mother, who had migrated to Brazil, I guess probably the early 1930s, for the mother hadn't been back to Japan in all those years, right? So for 50 or 60 years. The mother was getting old, and she decided to take her mother on like this kind of final trip to Japan, right? This plan for this great thing. So I came back, so I said to my friend Sunday, I said, man, how was that trip to Japan? It must have been amazing. She said, oh, Jeff, she said, it was the worst. I spent the entire time translating my mother's Japanese into Japanese that any Japanese person today could understand. They had no way of communicating because the language had changed. I mean, you know, have you ever tried talking to your great-grandparents, right? I mean, it's really different, right? So that's another interesting part about that Confederate question, right? Is in some ways it tells us a lot about this country of the United States. Yes?
So as a country that has identified itself as a nation of immigrants and taking immigrants, how has Brazil come to terms with being asked immigration laws to come into
That's a fantastic
or are
question.
those seen as the worst Brazilians?
Oh, this is, all right, so what's your name? What Tammy has asked a fantastic question, right? What she's pointed out is that while I've been talking about immigration to Brazil, in the last 35 years now, Brazil has also become a country of immigration, right? This is a new phenomenon for Brazil, right? That it's become a country of immigration. And so what Tammy has asked is, how are those Brazilians seen? What's up with them, right? With their identities. So it's, of course, complicated and not clear. So part of one general idea about people who emigrate from Brazil is that they're seen as doing something exciting and modern, right? The idea of leaving Brazil for another country to make your future is seen as very positive. However, not everybody makes it. And so one phenomenon, right, you get is between those who make it and those who don't make it, and the embarrassment of what happens. A second question is where you emigrate to, right? So there are different places where emigration is important. There's the United States, there's Portugal, there's Canada, there's Japan. And who migrates to where? It's not just by chance. So for example, in this area of New England, in the Boston area of New England, you have migrants from a particular state, largely from a particular state, Brazil, called Minas Gerais, and it's important. Minas Gerais means the general mines. And the reason there's a migration to this part of the country was because there were semi-precious gem corporations from New England that went to this state. I'm talking now in the 40s and 50s, right? To, I don't know, whatever, however you get the gems, to pick up the gems, right? I'm not quite sure, right? And that as that business started to trickle away, the Americans had all sorts of relationships with people in the local community. And I don't just mean like relationships like marriage partners and families, but also business relationships, all sorts of things. And so you started to get a migration to this part of the country. I went to one of the main cities in this state of Minas Gerais. It's called Governador Valadares, which is like the center of this migration to this part. And back in the day, when the dollar was strong in this city, you could buy everything in dollars there because the migration and the movement of money between kind of New England and that state was so intense, right? Now, on the other hand, you have the case of Japan. Japan, at its height, probably had 300,000 Brazilians. Why? Well, I mean, we have an expert here, so correct me when I get it wrong, please. But largely, what you had was a sense in Japan in the 1980s that there were too many foreigners doing the dirty work. And so some, I guess we can say it, we're friends here, some racist politicians kind of thought, if we can get foreigners who look like us, right, we can get people to do the dirty work, but we won't notice them. Something like that. And they created laws, visa categories. Is that fair or unfair? They created visa categories, special visa categories for people of Japanese descent to migrate to Brazil to work like in factories and stuff like that. And it was a time when there was a huge economic crisis in Brazil. And so there was an enormous migration. Hundreds of thousands of Brazilians went. Now, the Japanese didn't get what they were thinking because it turned out that the Japanese Brazilians, some looked like me, some looked like him, they would come with their spouses and their families, right? It wasn't as pure as the theory would hold. So that was one thing that went on. And the other fascinating thing that went on is the Japanese Brazilians kind of created, I guess we would call it a love-hate culture with Japan, right? And this is really interesting. So part of the way you enacted your Japanese-Brazilian identity in Japan was on the one hand to talk about how much you hated it there. On the other hand, to talk about how you being there were going to save the Japanese from themselves, right? If it weren't for us Brazilians, right, Japan would really go down the tubes. And the other incredible thing is that Japanese Brazilians reinterpreted their life in Japan in these kind of funny Brazilian terms. So I did field work in a town called Oizumi. It's like a crummy factory town in Japan, right? A really crummy factory town in Japan. And in this town, there were maybe roughly, I don't know, 15% of the town was Brazilian, and another 5% were Peruvians and Bolivians, all ostensibly of Japanese descent. But one of the great things about hanging out with the Brazilians is, you know, they'd say, you know, how's life? They'd say, yeah, it's terrible except for a few things. So they'd say, first of all, here in Japan, I make enough money to own an imported car, by which they meant a Toyota or a Honda, right? In other words, the cheapest possible car in Japan, but the most expensive possible car. They also found a very interesting kind of relationship to their identity, right? Because as I said, there were these tough moments where if you're a Brazilian and you're called Japanese all the time, it's a little bit weird, right? And so one of the phenomena we found in the research was that that Japanese Brazilians liked being in Japan because there were no identity questions about who they were. They were Brazilian. And I had an incredible experience once. I was walking in this town, and I was walking past a soccer field where these kids were playing football, right, soccer. So I go on the field and I meet these kids, and one of the kids is a Brazilian kid. So I said, you know, dude, how is it in Japan, right? And I was ready, like, for the prepared statement. Japan sucks, the Japanese are assholes, they're cold, they're uptight, they